I was able to raise $50,000 from this investor named Tim Draper, who's a really prominent venture capitalist.
Never once in my life has the failure been worse than what I imagined in my head.
Why would you be grateful for your failures? Why would you be happy to have had failures or have any positive, thoughts whatsoever towards it? And the reality is that failure is the greatest teacher you'll ever have.
Money must be funny in a rich lad's world. Money must be lovely in a poor lad's world.
Welcome back to another episode of the Rich Lad, Poor Lad show.
Great to be here, Oliver. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay, thanks. Busy day. Sales are starting to pick up. So happy days are here at last.
Excellent. Just dropped my mic. Sorry about that.
No worries. We can definitely run an episode at some point about setting up a podcast, that's for sure.
Exactly. We definitely need to do that. So today's episode, we have a couple different topics we're going to talk about. But I think just to kind of give the audience a heads up, I think one of the key things we're going to talk about today and discuss is going to be fear of failure. Fear of failure on a personal level, on a professional level, tying it a lot to the entrepreneurial journey and what it's like to be an entrepreneur and have this fear of failure be kind of this shadow that follows you everywhere you go. Leo and I both have our own experiences with this, and that's going to be the main focus of this episode.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of different ways to talk about it. And I think certainly different career paths hit failure differently. And in some, careers like in sales, it's just a day-to-day part of the job.
Correct.
And in others, it's something that's hugely important. If you make airplanes for Boeing, you should have an incredible fear of failure at all times because it's such a high-risk situation to be in.
It's true.
Whereas in other, it's all about getting over it and understanding things are a numbers game and failure is just going to be part of day-to-day life. And I think when you sent me the topic that you were kind of considering earlier today, I think a question that came to mind, and I think it's probably kind of a good one to consider, is how do you differentiate between what's a healthy fear of failure and how that can help you at times versus what's an unhealthy fear of failure? And how can you have an unhealthy mentality towards it where it really hinders you and prevents you from taking opportunities?
Yeah, it's a great question. Healthy versus unhealthy. I mean, I think my first impression and my first gut answer to that question is an unhealthy fear of failure is one that paralyzes you and doesn't even allow you to get started. Our minds are capable of incredible things, capable of creating incredible monsters that seem so horrific, so horrifying, so terrible that starting something, it's just not worth it. A quote that I love that I'm probably going to mess up by Marcus Aurelius goes something, I believe it's Marcus Aurelius. It's like a Stoic quote, but it goes something along the lines of fear. Okay, how does it go? It goes something along the lines of fear. Your worst fears always live in your mind, and they never really materialize in the real world. As in, when you think of a fear, when you think of something that scares you, you're capable of turning it into this horrific monster, like I was saying. But rarely does that horrific monster ever really come to exist in the real world. It doesn't really materialize into the real world. And I know that's a terrible summary of this beautiful Marcus Aurelius or Stoic quote, but that's really the truth. Don't you think, Leo, that's how it works?
Right. Yeah, of course. And I think 99% of the time, the fear is far greater than even the failure itself is. It's so easy to work yourself up about things that you end up just not doing them in the first place. And yeah, I think that's just something that is really important, and it's an important skill to get over in any career or really just in life in general, I think, is understanding that, failure happens, and it's kind of how you respond to it that's the most important thing. And I know for a lot of people, especially talking about entrepreneurship, fear of failure is really prominent because they're worried, what if it doesn't work? What if I quit my job? What if I, can't pay my rent? And while some of those are, rational fears to have, and it's understandable to be concerned that, if you have a mortgage, 4 kids, and costs that are coming in, day out, definitely you should have a fear of failure. And definitely you should probably put support mechanisms in place or ensure you have a parachute, so to speak, before you jump into the entrepreneurial journey. But for a lot of people, I feel like the fear of failure they pick up is kind of self-inflicted. They go, what will people think about me if I start something and it doesn't work? What will people say? What will my family think? And that stuff I think is really unhealthy, because if you have that mentality, you're just pigeonholing yourself and you're preventing the sort of choices you can make your whole life.
Yeah.
And you have to be able to kind of get past that and not worry about it as much.
What kind of works me up the most about fear of failure is really seeing fear of failure in young people. I mean, I think, it's when you're young, when you're in your 20s and let's say 30s, but especially your 20s, most people don't realize that this is the period of your life where you can take the biggest risks. You can take the greatest, you can place the biggest bets on yourself in your 20s. Because, chances are, if you're listening to this episode, if you're watching this episode, you're in a situation where if shit really hit the fan, you probably won't be on the street. And that fear that holds you back from doing something that you're excited about, or doing that project, starting that project, creating that art, taking that job, starting that company, taking that leap of faith, in your 20s, that is truly the best time of your life to do that, because you can fuck it up a bunch of times. And still, if you're a hustler, if you have that entrepreneurial mindset and you're not completely, you're not like, terrible at life, you can figure out a way to like scrape yourself up off the ground and get back on the horse and go back to college. I mean, I think talking about college, I was really afraid back in 2013, 2012, 2013. I did a year of university in England. And I remember having this big fight with my father about staying in college or dropping out of college, as well as just going to college to begin with. I remember at first I didn't want to go to university because I was working on Nutcase and I was really excited about just being all in, and I wanted to do the Zuckerberg and just, forget about college, just work on my project, right? But he convinced me to go. My parents convinced me to go because I got into a good school. And I was like, all right, fine. So I started and I hated it. I really disliked the courses. It was totally uninteresting to me because I was running my business out of my dorm room. And at a certain point, I wanted to drop out. And I remember having this battle. And, I think my father inadvertently was kind of putting this fear in my mind around, if you're burning the bridges, you're burning the ship if you drop out without having that safety net. And I was afraid. And for many years after dropping out of university, I carried this kind of like, I think it was definitely like 14, 15, 16, 17. I had this kind of complex about not having a degree and not being smart enough. And, because I don't have a degree, am I really going to be able to successfully run my business? And I kind of like wigged myself out a little bit. But that was also kind of a way fear of failure manifested itself in me. Did you have anything like that, Leo, in your upbringing or years?
Well, I mean, just talking about uni, I think you and I both, not growing up in the US, where university is tremendously expensive.
Right.
Definitely, I think, changed my thinking a little bit. because talking to people here and just talking about the amount of debt they take on, it's just staggering. And so I can definitely understand how sometimes people can get sunken cost bias, where you've put $100,000 of debt in, you've got a year left to finish a degree, and it's like, am I really going to drop out tomorrow? I've like kind of done this already. I'm already in the hole for this. I think for me in Australia,
but before you go, to address that example, in that circumstance, even if you were an entrepreneur, I mean, unless you had like, in the example where you've done 3 years of college, you've already taken on debt, you have 1 year to go, I would say 90% of the time, my advice would be to just finish it because you're already 3/4 of the way there. Unless there's an opportunity cost that's so great where if I don't drop out to take $1 million in funding from an investor, or I have customers that are paying me so much money, or I have so much validation on my business or on my project that I could afford to drop out and not worry about it, then that would be like the exceptions to the rule. But if you're listening and you're 3 years into college or you're 2 years into college, and you've already taken on debt, or your parents are paying for it, you do want to weigh out the pros and cons, because definitely having a degree is not going to harm you, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, we could go down that path, that rabbit hole more later. But
yeah, we can save the degree banter to really deep dive on another one. But no, yeah, of course I had fear of failure. As someone that also didn't finish university, at the time, it was also, among my friendship group, it was just the done thing. Like, you finish school, you take a gap year if you're lucky, which I was able to do. Then you go to university, and then after university, you kind of figure it out. And I think, when university wasn't working for me well, I definitely had a huge fear of failure. I saw everybody else, I took a year off in between studying as well. And I kind of saw people finishing up their jobs and kind of lining up their careers. And yeah, of course, I was definitely afraid of it not working out. But looking back on it, I think my biggest mistake was not leaving university earlier and not having an uncomfortable conversation with my family about, it wasn't working for me, it wasn't a fit, and kind of not pulling that Band-Aid off much earlier. I mean, I dragged this thing on, cost me still plenty of money. And, in hindsight, I at least have certainly learned more in my life outside university than in university. And I really am at the stage of my life now. It's funny you talked about going back to uni, or college. But it is something I've thought about in later years. I feel like now, having a few more years work experience under my belt, really clear crystal idea about what I want to do, and if I was to study, where I'd want to focus, means, I'm much more excited about the idea now of getting into university than I ever was when I was younger. Because when I was younger, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I was kind of saying, I'll just do it, and kind of you figure it out along the way. I mean, I took a course studying Mongolian. I took a course. I had to learn languages for the program I was doing, and I was terrible at them. And it had to be an Asian language. So I started in Indonesian, which I wasn't good at. Switched to Thai, which only got significantly worse from there. Switched to Mongolian, and it was, I mean, I don't know what I was thinking. People were saying there's going to be a mining boom. There has actually been, but a need for people that speak Mongolian. And then somehow I was able to do French, which somehow classified as an Asian language due to, I don't know, university cutting some of the languages. But that's kind of a tangent. But I definitely think, looking back on it, I had a really unhealthy fear of failure, because it led me to do something I didn't want to do and continued doing something I didn't want to do for much longer than I should have. And, to your point about your, sort of Marcus Aurelius quote, even when all's said and done, and I had to have some pretty, unpleasant conversations about it, man, what a relief. And my life has been significantly better since that.
Right.
And I think, a healthy fear of failure is, stressing out before an exam. An unhealthy fear of failure is, not eating and not drinking. It's just about getting the balance right.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be interesting to talk about a framework or some sort of process that one could take to really analyze, the pros and cons of taking a risk in one's life and whether or not that, fear is valid or not. I feel like in the past, I've definitely used, kind of like pro and con lists to measure in a somewhat, informal way the pros and cons of taking on a risk or not, or taking that leap. I think having, regardless of your age, having somebody, a mentor or advisor or parent to, someone you really deeply trust, kind of triangulating feedback on your idea or your project or, whatever that thing is that you're thinking of doing that scares you. I think that's really been useful for me. And I've been lucky enough to have great friends and mentors and advisors in my career so far to help me think through this stuff. In fact, I almost feel like I could have probably seeked out more advice and more guidance than I had, on some of the decisions that I made. But yeah, I mean, I think, fear of failure is something that's natural. You're definitely not the only one. You're definitely not the only one who experiences it. I feel like there's definitely a lot of people who, perhaps on social media give off this, this impression of being, what's that word I'm looking for? Untouchable from that perspective. Someone that's just so confident and successful and has it so figured out. I mean, that's the impression I try to give on social media for the most part,
Right.
just being honest. Because
Right.
no one, but at the same time, I think that's why we're doing this podcast too, because we want to share with the audience that, we are human, we're all fighting our own demons, and it's normal to be afraid of taking that leap and that first step. Yeah, I mean, from a failure perspective, Leo, what do you think? Are there any examples in your life where the fear of failure was justified, where maybe you did fail at something and the consequences were worse than you expected or not as bad as you expected? Were there any instances in your life that come to mind in that circumstance as an example to talk about? And then I could go as well.
In personal life and everything else. But no, I mean, the great joy and why I'm getting better and better at this every single day is not once have I really been, it was worse than I possibly thought it would be. Yeah, I've had reactions. Yeah, I've made mistakes that turned out to be bigger mistakes. But, I've definitely, lost more money on things than I thought I would. And, have doubled down on what were bad investments or bad decisions. But no, it's never really been as bad. How about for you?
I'm not surprised. I mean, I think that goes right back to that Stoic quote where it's like we think the consequences are going to be so much worse than they really are. And, I think age, maturity, and experience is really the only thing that can really burst that bubble. I wish I had the inner belief and self-confidence at the age of 21 and 22 when I was just starting my career in the startup world to just feel the way I feel now. And the way I feel now is I'm not really that afraid of most things.
Right.
And I'm not really afraid of most things now, even though I'm still taking big risks, because I've gone through enough shit now to realize the consequences aren't that bad. But when you're younger, especially, I think this is really trying to speak to that younger audience. It's when you're in your teenage years, you're 18, 19, 20, your early 20s, where you just naturally don't have that much experience because you're freaking young. It's not your fault. And for what it's worth, I'd love to just be able to say, trust us. You don't have to be so afraid. But it's hard to do that because it's just like an animal instinct. It's like evolutionarily, like Leo said at the beginning of the episode, I'm afraid of being judged by my friends and family, being labeled as a failure, the embarrassment. I think some people have it harder than others regarding the cultural stigmas of failure and taking risks.
Right.
Thankfully, I don't think you and I really had that badly growing up. I don't know, actually. I don't know about you, but for me, definitely I didn't. But it was more self-imposed fear, just like embarrassment and things that held me back. Do you have anything to say on that?
It's embarrassment. Yeah, embarrassment you mentioned is a really good one. Because to your original question about times when it's been worse than my sort of thoughts were, it's never happened. But there are so many times I look back on and I realize my kind of fear really, disadvantaged me. I mean, just to give examples, when I was, doing my brief stints at college, my father was loosely connected to a network of people, and I got into some really fascinating rooms with fascinating people. And he would always encourage me, go up to them, introduce yourself, say who you are, say, you just want to, it was like a kind of networking, just introduce yourself. It's a small world, especially some of the, the people I got the chance to meet, brilliant academics, dignitaries, politicians, stuff like that. And I so rarely did it. I was so freaking stupid. I mean, I was, a couple of things over, was high ups at the United Nations, things like that, which at the time I was really interested in. And I was like, oh, they're not going to want to talk to me. They're not going to care what I have to say. They're not going to want to, take a few minutes. No, I can't. That's too embarrassing. They're going to shun me. They're going to whatever. And looking back on it now, it's just like, how stupid was I?
Right.
Like, what was the worst that was going to happen? What's the absolute worst? To go up and you're much better at this than me, but I definitely struggled with it for a long time. Just going up and introduce myself and say, I just want to meet you, I think whatever it might be. And I, in my head, would have these whole, they're going to laugh at me, everyone's going to stop talking. And looking back, and my dad used to say exactly what you just said now, which is like, just trust me. They're going to love it. They're going to be interested. They want to meet young people. Everybody wants to meet young people, hear their ideas and talk to them and whatnot. I said, no, I won't. And I missed a hell of a lot of great opportunities by not doing it at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember I saw people in my cohort who would do this. And they're now, they've kept up connections. They're in different circles and they've kind of, life's diverged a little bit. But I still regret it to this day. And something I've really tried to avoid being now is like, if you go up to someone and just like, you're polite, you're friendly, you want to learn. The same way, happens less when I talk to younger people, like, it's always fun. It's fun to kind of share your thoughts, get their perspective on things as well. And it's like, the worst thing they can be is be an asshole. They can say, hey man, not right now. Like, all right. Like, that's the worst thing. But in your head, it becomes like, people are going to talk about it. People are going to, whatever it might be.
No, I agree. And I think, to answer your earlier question, my fear, what were some of my biggest fears and whether or not they ever materialized? I have a lot. I really suffered a lot from the fear of failure. And I think the most powerful stories that I had related to this really have to do with my early 20s when I was in Silicon Valley and I was in a situation where I was thrown right in the deep end. I threw myself in the deep end, which is part of my, way of learning by doing, and it's kind of a painful way to learn, but I do think it's, I think it's one of the best ways to learn is to just kind of throw yourself in the deep end, build the parachute as you jump off the cliff and you're falling towards the ground. But that does have the side effects, and the side effects of that are a lot of issues. And so just to dive right into it, the example that I want to share is I was able to raise $50,000 from this investor named Tim Draper, who's a really prominent venture capitalist. He's like his grandfather invented venture capital. His father was a legendary venture capitalist. He's a legendary venture capitalist. His son's a legendary it's like they're like the venture capital family. They're the Drapers. I went through his program. I won his competition. I essentially was able to get this $50K with a couple co-founders on this project that I started. And we spent the money trying to start this company. We tried to raise more money for the company. It didn't work out. And I kind of got to the point where I had to throw in the towel. And it was really, really difficult for me to process and to accept defeat. And I was honestly terrified of the consequences. So anyhow, I won this competition. I tried to start this company called Floaty with a couple co-founders. It was a crazy experience. 50K lasted us about almost 2 years living in San Francisco, working full-time on this project. But we spent the money and we couldn't raise follow-on funding. And at a certain point, I was the last man standing. My other co-founders and I, we kind of went our separate ways, and I was kind of the last man standing, and I had to throw in the towel. And that fear of accepting defeat, of having to admit defeat to the legendary Tim Draper, was so cataclysmic for me that it was honestly like a nightmare. It was truly like a nightmare. And it lasted years. And I tried to find ways, and I felt this guilt. I felt a guilt that I carried for years, that I had spent his money, I hadn't brought him a return, I hadn't been able to follow through on my word, which is to build an exceptional company. Little did I really know that, the odds and the probability of starting a successful technology company and turning it into a unicorn are, whatever that statistic is, 0.001% or whatever, But I was 21 years old at the time, and that was what I was feeling. And so that was a fear of failure that was real. The failure happened. I failed. And, and it was terrible. But the moral of the story, the lesson is I should not have felt that way, because the reality is that losing a deal, I was just one of thousands of projects and startups that Tim was investing in through his fund, personally, through the Draper University network. I was just one horse that was being bet on. And as part of venture capital, you know that you're hedging your bet. I mean, you're betting on hundreds of horses at a time, working under that assumption. And I felt so much guilt for not being able to return that $50,000. Meanwhile, Tim is a billionaire. He made hundreds of millions of dollars over the past 10 years through his investments and through Bitcoin. The $50K, it's nothing. But for me, it was the principle. It was the principle of it. But it was also an immaturity on my end, where it's like, it was unhealthy for me to have this crippling fear and guilt and anxiety about this situation, because it was holding me back from having the mental health, to the healthy mental health to really move on and do my best work. And so that's an example where, like I said, it was a fear of failure. There was a real failure. The consequences were not bad. They didn't come after me. They didn't threaten me. They didn't sue me. I was running through all these scenarios. None of that happened. And, and I'm not saying, $50,000 is chump change that could just be flushed down the toilet. But I can tell you in all earnest that I worked my ass off for those 2 years. I tried my absolute best to make it happen.
Right.
This wasn't a fire festival. What's the lad's name? $10 million of investors' money pissed away with poor execution and fraudulent activity. This was just my first rodeo as an entrepreneur trying to build a tech company, and it flopped. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts there on that, but that's kind of my close. I have other stories which we can get into another time, but that was probably the most emotionally challenging one for me to cope with in my 20s.
Well, and I think it's something that, at first I think it's a great story, and that's a great example to talk about, where I guess if you talk about it through the lens of, I lost his money, then maybe that is thing. But I think if you think about it more, exactly to your point, you put 2 years of your life into this project. And, a group of people surviving in San Francisco over a couple of years for $50,000 is impressive in and of itself. And it was kind of a known risk on the other person's part. And I think as long as you can really justify to yourself that you tried your best, you worked your hardest, people kind of respect that and they get that. I think that it's really about calling failure or throwing in the towel early or giving up at the moment it got a little bit hard, but then it becomes, you do have guilt that kind of sticks with you.
Correct.
And if you'd kind of 6 months into it going, it's kind of a struggle, everything's not working perfect, and then you do it, I think there is, people understand that as well. And that's when you do see,
right.
Pressure and everything else like that coming in.
No, that's a very good point.
But no, I think that
there's definitely an episode to be had on that as well, regarding specifically persisting on something or pivoting, or not even pivoting, but like persisting or throwing in the towel. I think there's a great episode for us to have on that. I have a few battle stories in that realm. But I know we're going to be wrapping up soon. I want to leave off with another thought for the audience, another message, which is really, the reality is I feel tremendously grateful for all the failures that I've had in my career up until now. And some of you might be watching that and scratching your head and saying, well, that's messed up. Like, why would you be grateful for your failures? Why would you be happy to have had failures? Or have any positive, thoughts whatsoever towards it. And the reality is that failure is the greatest teacher you'll ever have. And I can assure you, I wouldn't be where I am today working and experiencing the success that finally I'm starting to experience in my career had I not fucked it up multiple times in my earlier years. And I'm still right. Failing now in different ways, shapes, and forms. But failure to me was an incredibly important part of my development as an entrepreneur. And it was expensive in certain scenarios. It was expensive. But in my heart of hearts, as an entrepreneur, every project I took on, I gave my blood, sweat, and tears. And I've always been able to show the evidence and show my stakeholders, investors, advisors, mentors, co-founders that I gave it my all. And sometimes things just aren't destined to work out, but those experiences, those failures early in your life or at any point in your life, it's really up to you how to process them. And for me, I really don't think I would be doing what I'm doing today had things just worked out beautifully. And honestly, I wouldn't be as experienced as an entrepreneur, business person, founder, salesperson, I just wouldn't have this level of experience if I got lucky, in a sense, in my earlier years, and things had just worked out perfectly. If I had gone into my first investor meeting and just been able to close the $300K that I was dying to meet, what would I have learned from that? My ego would have gone through the roof. I would have thought I was the hottest shit since sliced bread. Where's the learning? I got rejected from literally at least 200 investors over the past 10 years. Probably more than that, honestly. That's an understatement. I got rejected by at least 150 when I was in Silicon Valley, And then Scooterino was another host of at least another 100 or 200 investors. There's nothing you don't learn from what you do right. You only learn from what you do wrong. And that fear of failure is something that, is real, but there's always an opportunity to flip it on its head and to find a way to grow from it. And that's really my closing message that I want to share.
No, I think it's a great message. And I think, yeah, really good message. And hopefully, we provided a small little jump in enthusiasm for people to try and, conquer the fear of failure and, move ahead in their endeavors. Yeah.
And just not let it paralyze you. And like I said, as long as you're not doing something so haphazardly and as long as you're not being stupid about it, it's like if you put in the due diligence, you put in the hours to do the research, to understand the pros and cons, to understand the strategy, and to be able to make a calculated risk. My father, he was always a good mentor for me, and he still is to this day. And he's always been about take calculated risks, and that's a good way of putting it. Taking a risk on a whim and just going for something without doing the due diligence and the heavy lifting to validate and that's a mistake. And you should be afraid of the failure and the consequences that come with making that decision. But for those of you watching that have done the research or done the homework and you have an idea and you're young or you're old, just go for it. You're not going to regret it. Life is short, and it's going to be worth the story one day. So thanks for watching, guys. Appreciate the time. Appreciate you guys tuning in. Please do not forget to subscribe and like. I feel so cool saying that. It feels like we're actually doing a real show saying that, which is cool. So yeah, please like and subscribe, and follow us on all the social media links that we have in the show notes below as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Ollie. We'll talk soon.
Talk soon. Cheers.
Salute.
Mate. Salute. We'll do the salute. That's my new thing. The salute's my new thing.
The closing salute. All right, bud.